At the beginning of the 20th century, the European scientific map showed an unusual concentration of activity in the German territory. The universities of Berlin, Göttingen, Leipzig, and Munich functioned as nodes of a system where research was directly integrated into the state structure. They were institutions that combined advanced teaching with laboratories equipped to explore the limits of physics, chemistry, and engineering. Germany had promoted this architecture since the end of the 19th century, when the Prussian state considered that scientific knowledge could guarantee industrial independence and technological superiority. The result was an environment where science became a central element of national development. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, founded from 1911 onward, represented the culmination of this model. Designed to accommodate specialized research, they were funded by both the government and industry. They allowed scientists to engage in cutting-edge research without experiencing the economic restrictions common in other countries. This academic and technical ecosystem placed Germany in a privileged position at the start of the 20th century, especially in the emerging field of theoretical physics. The most significant breakthrough came in 1900, when Max Planck introduced the concept of the quantum to explain black body radiation. The proposal broke with the principles of classical physics and opened a path that others would quickly follow. In 1905, Albert Einstein, then an employee of the Bern Patent Office but integrated into the German academic circuit, presented his theory of special relativity, followed a decade later by general relativity. These ideas transformed the understanding of space, time, and gravity. Throughout the 1920s, quantum physics took definitive shape with contributions from Werner Heisenberg, who in 1927 formulated the uncertainty principle, and from Erwin Schrödinger, the author of the wave equation. Max Born introduced the probabilistic interpretation of quantum behavior. These advances led to the creation of a scientific community that operated with a high degree of cohesion. Young researchers frequently traveled between centers like Berlin, Göttingen, and Copenhagen, where Niels Bohr was developing his own contributions. The correspondence between these groups revealed a dynamic and competitive network where new ideas spread quickly. While theoretical physics advanced in this direction, the study of the atom was transforming into an independent field. By the end of the 19th century, Marie Curie had demonstrated the existence of radioactive elements. In 1911, Ernest Rutherford modeled the atom with a dense nucleus inside. In 1932, James Chadwick discovered the neutron, the particle that completed the modern nuclear structure. These discoveries spurred research aimed at understanding the stability of heavy nuclei and their possible transformations. Germany actively participated in this process, observing with interest how radioactivity and neutrons could modify the structure of the elements. In Berlin, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry became a reference center for this type of study. There, Lise Meitner, Otto Hahn, and Fritz Strassmann worked for years on experiments that involved bombarding uranium with neutrons to observe the resulting products. The technique was simple in appearance, but it offered results that were difficult to interpret. Lighter elements than uranium often appeared, but there was no theoretical framework to explain how they were produced. The general assumption was that the neutrons knocked off small fragments from the nucleus, creating new elements in a marginal way. In 1933, this scientific environment underwent an abrupt transformation. The rise of Adolf Hitler to power introduced measures that immediately affected universities and institutes. The racial laws prohibited Jews from holding academic or administrative positions, and the changes were implemented without transition. Albert Einstein, who was out of the country when the laws were passed, decided not to return. Max Born was expelled from his professorship in Göttingen. James Franck left his position before being officially removed. Lise Meitner was able to continue for a time thanks to her Austrian citizenship. But the annexation of Austria in 1938 made her stay in Germany untenable, leading her to exile in Sweden. These decisions caused a considerable loss of talent. The United States and Great Britain absorbed many of the displaced scientists. Leo Szilard, Eugene Wigner, Edward Teller, and Hans Bethe all of whom were partially or fully trained in Germany, continued their careers abroad. The fragmentation of the German scientific community was immediate. Additionally, an internal movement known as German physics or Aryan physics emerged, promoted by Philipp Lenard and Johannes Stark. This current questioned the validity of relativity and quantum mechanics, as they were seen as constructs foreign to the German scientific tradition. Although the regime did not officially adopt these positions, political pressure created tensions and made it difficult for those who supported modern physics to work. Despite the adverse weather, experimental progress continued in the nuclear field. In the last months of 1938, Hahn and Strassmann identified barium and other elements with a mass approximately half that of uranium among the products of their experiments. The result contradicted all previous interpretations. Confused, Hahn informed Meitner about the findings. From Sweden, Meitner analyzed the data together with Otto Frisch. Both concluded that the uranium nucleus was not partially fragmenting, but rather splitting into two nuclei of comparable size. The process released a significantly greater amount of energy than any known chemical reaction. Meitner and Frisch calculated that energy by applying Einstein's equation relating mass and energy. They estimated that the splitting of a single uranium nucleus could release about 200 million electron volts. The magnitude of the data placed the phenomenon in a completely different category from any atomic transformation previously studied. They published their analysis in February of 1939, introducing the term nuclear fission. Hahn and Strassmann, on the other hand, had presented the experimental results in January. The dissemination of both works generated an immediate response in laboratories of several countries. In the United States, groups at Columbia University, led by Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, confirmed that fission released additional neutrons. In Paris, Frédéric Joliot-Curie obtained similar results. These secondary neutrons allowed, at least in theory, a chain reaction. Each fission event could trigger multiple subsequent events. If the process was controlled, it could generate energy in a sustained way. If allowed to proceed without restrictions, the exponential increase in reactions could produce a sudden release of energy with explosive effects. At this point, another element proved decisive. Niels Bohr, visiting the United States, explained that only a minimal fraction of natural uranium, the uranium-235 isotope, was prone to fission with slow neutrons. The rest, uranium-238, absorbed neutrons without fissioning with the same ease. This implied that to create an efficient chain reaction, it would be necessary to separate or enrich uranium-235, an extremely complex task due to the chemical similarity between both isotopes. The scientific race to understand and apply nuclear fission then acquired a technological and strategic component. The international situation added a sense of urgency. In March of 1939, Germany occupied Czechoslovakia, securing control of uranium mines located in the region. In August, it signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, establishing a temporary coordination with the Soviet Union. On the 1st of September, the invasion of Poland marked the beginning of the Second World War. Nuclear fission had been discovered a few months earlier, but the speed of the conflict transformed it from an academic curiosity into a possible military resource. In the United States, scientists displaced from Europe immediately detected this connection. In August of 1939, Szilard convinced Einstein to sign a letter addressed to President Franklin Roosevelt. The document alerted about the potential construction of explosive devices based on nuclear fission and recommended securing uranium sources. Roosevelt created an advisory committee with limited resources, tasked with assessing the viability of such a project. During the following months, this group conducted exploratory studies with still uncertain results. The estimates about the time necessary to develop a bomb varied widely, and the degree of technical difficulty made it impossible to foresee a reliable schedule. In Germany, the initial understanding of fission followed a parallel path. The physicists who remained in the country, among them Werner Heisenberg, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Walter Bothe and Kurt Diebner began their own calculations on the possibility of controlling a chain reaction. They analyzed the use of graphite or heavy water as moderators to slow down neutrons, and examined the amount of uranium-235 necessary to produce a critical mass. In the fall of 1939, the Heereswaffenamt, the Army's Ordnance Office, convened several of these scientists to evaluate military applications. The group examined two paths: the creation of a uranium machine capable of generating energy or producing new materials, and the development of a bomb based on an uncontrolled chain reaction. Both options seemed possible in principle, but they required solving technical problems for which there were no immediate solutions. The production of pure moderators, the isotopic separation of uranium, and the construction of a critical reactor were unprecedented tasks. At the same time, the outbreak of the war concentrated German resources on conventional weaponry. The administrative structure of the regime, marked by institutional rivalries, made it difficult to coordinate a long-term project. Thus, Germany reached the end of 1939 with advanced knowledge about fission, a scientific community reduced by purges, and a political landscape that transformed any technical decision into a complex process. The potential of the new phenomenon was clear, but there was not yet a defined mechanism to convert it into a structured military project. The first actions of the Army would mark the beginning of that transformation, opening a stage in which nuclear science would come to depend on decisions made outside the laboratories. The invasion of Poland in September of 1939 immediately transformed the scientific priorities of the Third Reich. Just 3 weeks after the start of the conflict, on the 26th of September, the Heereswaffenamt summoned several of the most experienced physicists in the country to urgently assess the military implications of the discovery of nuclear fission. The meeting took place in Berlin and established the first official structure to study practical applications of the new phenomenon. Kurt Diebner, an official of the Heereswaffenamt itself, assumed the initial coordination. His role was not to direct the research from a scientific point of view, but to ensure that any progress was integrated within the Army's procedures and priorities. In that meeting, 2 lines of research were proposed. The first consisted of developing a uranium machine, a device capable of sustaining a controlled chain reaction through the appropriate use of fuel and neutron moderators. Its operation could generate usable heat or produce derivative radioactive materials. The second approach, more direct, considered the possibility of gathering enough uranium-235 for the chain reaction to become uncontrolled and release its energy suddenly. Initial calculations indicated that the critical mass needed for an explosion was very high, and existing techniques for isotope separation were not prepared to produce it. Even so, both options deserved systematic study. The group soon received a name that would become common in official documents and in correspondence between scientists: Uranverein, the so-called Uranium Club. The term reflected the ambiguous nature of the project. It was not a formal military body, yet it did not operate with the typical freedom of academic communities. Its activity lay in an intermediate position. The objectives were defined by the Army, while the methods remained those of scientific research. This mixture produced an unstable balance that would accompany the program throughout its entire existence. Throughout the autumn of 1939, the Uranverein incorporated specialists from different institutions of the Reich. Werner Heisenberg, from Leipzig, provided the theoretical basis necessary to estimate the probability of fission under different conditions. Walter Bothe, from Heidelberg, coordinated neutron measurement experiments. Paul Hartek, in Hamburg, studied methods of isotopic separation. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker explored nuclear reactions from a theoretical approach. Each one contributed from their field with complementary analyses. The integration of these profiles sought to identify a reasonable way to reproduce a chain reaction under controlled conditions. The initial objective was to determine if natural uranium could sustain a chain reaction when the neutrons were properly moderated. Natural uranium mainly contained uranium-238, which barely fissioned with slow neutrons, and a very small fraction of uranium-235, which did. For the assembly to work, it was necessary to slow down the neutrons released in each fission, so that they had a higher probability of causing new fissions in uranium-235 nuclei. The material responsible for slowing down those neutrons had to meet strict conditions, not absorb them excessively, and allow the fuel to release enough neutrons to sustain the reaction. Graphite was a logical candidate. Heavy water was as well. Ordinary water, however, was not viable due to hydrogen's strong capacity to absorb neutrons. Botha was given the responsibility of accurately measuring the neutron absorption of the graphite available in Germany. His experiments indicated absorption levels that were too high, which led to this material being discarded. The conclusion was incorrect. The graphite provided by the German industry contained impurities, especially boron, that skewed the measurements. Ultra-pure graphite would have worked adequately, as Allied research would later show. The error, however, decisively oriented the direction of the German program. Heavy water became the moderator of choice. The choice of moderator had direct consequences on the strategy of the Uran-Verein. Graphite could be produced in large quantities if purified through appropriate procedures. Heavy water, on the other hand, existed only in small quantities. The main industrial plant capable of generating it in significant volumes was located in Vemork, Norway, within the Norsk hydro complex. Its annual production was limited. Obtaining the necessary tons for an operational reactor required a significant logistical effort that would only be possible if Germany secured territorial control of Norway, something that would not occur until the invasion of 1940. While the group analyzed moderators, Hartek focused on methods for separating uranium isotopes. The problem was fundamental. The chemical properties of uranium-235 and uranium-238 were practically identical. The separation had to be based solely on their mass differences. Possible techniques included thermal diffusion, ultracentrifuges, and gaseous diffusion using porous membranes. All of them were theoretically viable, but none had been developed to handle large volumes. Hartek was able to enrich minimal amounts through thermal diffusion in an experimental setup, demonstrating that the principle was solid. However, scaling up that system to produce kilograms or tons required facilities that Germany did not have, and that, given the priorities of the war, would be difficult to justify. In December of 1939, Heisenberg presented a synthesis report to the Heereswaffenamt. It explained that a chain reaction was physically possible using natural uranium with heavy water as a moderator. He further estimated that the critical mass of uranium-235 needed for a bomb was between 10 and 100 kilograms, a significantly lower range than initially calculated. Despite this improvement in estimates, the gap between theory and practical engineering remained enormous. The report did not recommend immediately starting the construction of a weapon. It was limited to presenting the data and pointing out the technological obstacles that would need to be overcome. The reaction of the German High Command was cautious. They recognized the potential importance of the discovery, but did not consider that the situation required an accelerated effort. At that time, the regime relied on the success of its conventional military campaigns. The invasion of France was in preparation, and the recent experience in Poland reinforced the belief in a quick war. A nuclear program that would require years was perceived as an investment of uncertain utility. The result was that the Uran-Verein advanced without receiving massive resources or absolute priority. In April of 1940, Germany initiated the operation to occupy Denmark and Norway. In this context, the Vemork plant acquired relevance. After the occupation, the regime imposed strict control over the production of heavy water. Inspectors and military personnel were sent to supervise the processes. The first shipments began to be sent to the Reich, although the quantity available remained small. Despite the supply, the gap between the needs of the projected reactor and the real production capacity of the Norwegian plant continued to be an obstacle. With the arrival of the first batches of heavy water and small amounts of metallic uranium produced by the German industry, Deibner and his team began the preliminary design of an experimental reactor. The plans considered structures formed by alternating layers of uranium and heavy water, arranged so that the produced neutrons could be moderated and reused. Heisenberg calculated that several tons of metallic uranium and at least 1 ton of heavy water would be needed to reach a critical design. Neither of these materials existed in the required quantities. The production of metallic uranium was especially problematic. Companies like Our Gesellschaft and Degussa were working to improve the purity of the metal, but the results were coming slowly and in reduced volumes. As the investigation progressed, administrative tensions arose. The Heereswaffenamt retained formal authority over the project, but other institutions sought to increase their influence. The Reichsforschungsrat, which coordinated scientific research in the Reich, wanted to oversee the program. The Ministry of Education claimed the management of university physicists. The Luftwaffe was exploring its own applications. The SS showed interest in new technological developments. This overlap of competencies made coordination difficult and fragmented the use of resources. In contrast to the centralized model that the Allies would adopt later, the German program operated in a dispersed framework, subject to internal rivalries that complicated any sustained progress. The differences between Deibner and Heisenberg reflected these tensions. Deibner, as a representative of the army, favored practical and quick solutions, even if they required technical compromises. Heisenberg prioritized theoretical understanding and rigorous calculations before undertaking large-scale developments. The lack of unified direction turned these discrepancies into persistent obstacles that reduced the efficiency of the program. The landscape changed in June of 1941 with the start of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa intensified the war and forced the German army to review all research projects. The criterion was strict. Only those with reasonable chances of producing military results in a short time would continue. An experimental reactor could eventually be achieved, but it would not provide decisive advantages on the battlefield. A bomb required even more time and faced technological challenges that no one could guarantee to solve. The Uranverein was the subject of this evaluation. The difficulties of obtaining materials in sufficient quantities, the absence of adequate industrial facilities, and the complexity of the enrichment process led the Heereswaffenamt to reduce the priority of the program during the second half of 1941. Part of the staff was reassigned to more immediate projects. The resources diminished. The initial momentum weakened. By the end of 1941, the German nuclear program continued to exist, but in a limited state. Physicists had identified the necessary principles to build a reactor and understood the basic requirements for a bomb. However, they had not achieved any decisive experimental breakthrough. They lacked industrial infrastructure and coordinated leadership. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States was beginning to concentrate human and industrial resources on an unprecedented scale to develop the same technology. The Uranverein was advancing slowly, conditioned by decisions made in 1939 and 1940, by the lack of critical materials, and by a complex administrative environment. With the outbreak of total war on the Eastern Front and the redistribution of priorities, the program was relegated to the background. Its continuity now depended more on individual laboratory initiatives than on a state strategic plan. Even so, the group maintained the intention of building a functional uranium machine, a goal that would mark the beginning of a new phase focused on increasingly complex technical experiments. When the German nuclear program started in 1941, the main obstacles were no longer found in fundamental physics, but in the translation of that physics to experimental systems capable of demonstrating concrete progress. Reactor design required exact geometries, pure materials, and precise calculations on the behavior of neutrons in different configurations. Each decision about shape, size, or composition affected the balance between neutrons produced and neutrons lost. The objective was to reach a point at which the number of neutrons generated in each phase of the process equaled or exceeded the number absorbed or escaped. Only in this way would a self-sustaining chain reaction be achieved. The first serious attempt was carried out at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. The team led by Kurt Diebner designed a reactor using alternating layers of uranium oxide and heavy water contained in an aluminum cylinder. The metallic material offered ease of manufacture and strength, but had the disadvantage of absorbing neutrons in undesirable quantities. At the end of 1940, when enough material was gathered, the device was activated. The detectors recorded neutron multiplication, a sign that the system was responding as expected, but the multiplication factor remained below 1. The reaction was not sustained. The design consumed neutrons faster than it was able to produce them. After analyzing the results, Werner Heisenberg concluded that the structure of horizontal layers limited the efficiency. He proposed a three-dimensional configuration made up of cubes of metallic uranium suspended in heavy water, which would allow neutrons to move in multiple directions, increasing the probability of useful interactions. However, this approach depended on having several hundred cubes of high-purity metallic uranium. The German industry was just beginning to produce small quantities of that material, and the quality of the initial batches showed significant variations. The fabrication of metallic uranium was carried out through the chemical reduction of uranium oxide with calcium or magnesium. The process, conducted by companies like Auer Gesellschaft and Degussa, produced metal with residual impurities that absorbed neutrons. To improve purity, it was necessary to remelt the uranium repeatedly in controlled atmospheres, a method that required time and specialized equipment. By the mid-1941, the total production barely reached a few hundred kilograms, far from the tons needed for a critical reactor. The uncertainty about the quality of the batches even prevented planning exact designs, since each fragment of the metal had slightly different properties. The situation with heavy water was equally restrictive. The Vemork plant in Norway produced around 120 kilograms per month, an insufficient amount for large-scale experiments. This limitation was critical. The Uhrenverein depended exclusively on Vemork because graphite had been discarded as a moderator due to measurements carried out with impure samples. The initial error forced an absolute dependence on heavy water, whose production was slow, vulnerable, and difficult to store in large volumes. When Germany occupied Norway, it secured the plant, but it could not significantly accelerate production without expanding installations that required time and materials the regime needed for other purposes. As the war progressed, the strategic importance of Vemork became evident to the Allies. The Norwegian resistance transmitted information to the British about the growing German presence at the plant and about the transport of barrels of heavy water to the Reich. In 1942, the first sabotage operation was launched, which ended in failure after the gliders carrying the British commandos crashed. The result alerted Germany to the Allied interest, but did not alter the Uhrenverein's technical dependency. In February of 1943, a group of Norwegian saboteurs managed to infiltrate the plant and destroyed the electrolysis cells where heavy water was concentrated. The accumulated production was lost. Although the Germans repaired the plant, the incident demonstrated its vulnerability. Months later, the US Air Force bombed the complex, causing further delays. Finally, at the end of 1943, it was decided to evacuate all available heavy water to Germany, which led to the sinking of the ferry that was transporting it when the resistance attacked the vessel in Lake Tinn. With this, the Uhrenverein lost most of the moderator on which it had based its entire strategy. Meanwhile, the uranium enrichment work was progressing with limited resources. Paul Hartek continued experiments with thermal diffusion. Although he managed to enrich minuscule fractions of uranium, the method required thousands of devices operating simultaneously to obtain significant amounts. The electrical energy needed to operate a plant of that type was equivalent to the consumption of a city. Under bombings and with priorities directed to the production of conventional weaponry, Germany could not allocate such an amount of resources to a project with uncertain results. Other laboratories explored alternatives. Manfred von Ardenne developed electromagnetic separation systems using large mass spectrographs. The principle, based on the different deflection of isotopes in a magnetic field, was valid but extremely inefficient. Grams of enriched uranium required days of operation and enormous amounts of energy. Wilhelm Groth in Hamburg researched gaseous diffusion, which consisted of forcing a gas of uranium hexafluoride to pass through membranes with microscopic pores. The method was considered one of the most promising, but Germany lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture membranes that were uniform and resistant to the chemical corrosion of the gas. The experiments were confined to the laboratory. The central problem was not the lack of scientific knowledge. German physicists understood the principles of each technique. The challenge lay in the industrial engineering required to produce nuclear materials on useful scales. Each method involved building large-scale facilities, developing specialized equipment, and sustaining continuous production over long periods. The total war context made it unlikely that resources of such magnitude would be allocated to an experimental project. Albert Speer, armaments minister since 1942, reviewed scientific projects with the aim of prioritizing developments with immediate impact. When he asked Heisenberg for an estimate of the time needed to build a bomb if all available resources were granted, the answer was vague and not very encouraging. Even with total support, the process would require several years. Speer decided to focus resources on projects like the V-2 rockets, jet airplanes, and enhanced submarines. These were technologies with immediate military applications and whose development, although complex, was advancing in shorter timeframes. The consequence for the Uran-Verein was clear. The program was reduced to a set of laboratory investigations without broad funding or centralized political support. The scientific foundations were not questioned, but strategic interest diminished as efforts focused on short-term conventional weapons. In this context, the research groups moved away from the bombed urban centers. Heisenberg and his team settled in Göttingen and used a nearby cave in Haigerloch to build an experimental reactor. The move aimed to ensure continuity in a less vulnerable environment to air attacks. The Haigerloch reactor consisted of metal uranium cubes suspended in heavy water inside a cylindrical tank. The three-dimensional matrix allowed for the study of neutron multiplication in a configuration more efficient than previous designs. The team gathered approximately 1.5 tons of uranium and a similar amount of heavy water. Although these were significant volumes, they were still insufficient to reach criticality according to Heisenberg's calculations. The reactor was activated in March of 1945 and showed subcritical multiplication. The system operated as theory predicted, but the available material did not allow for sustaining the reaction without an external supply of neutrons. Simultaneously, the German program remained fragmented from an administrative and technical viewpoint. Deibner, Heisenberg, von Ardenne, Hartek, and Groth worked in different locations, with varying resources and under different authorities. There was no centralized structure to unify efforts or a single direction to establish clear priorities. The lack of coordination meant duplication of work, irregular exchange of information, and absence of a coherent strategy. While the Manhattan Project integrated scientists, engineers, military and industrial personnel into a centralized system, the Uran-Verein represented a set of partially isolated initiatives. The administrative structure of the Third Reich, characterized by internal rivalries and duplication of functions, reinforced this fragmentation. Decisions were made at multiple levels, and responsibilities overlapped between agencies. The result was a dispersed management that affected the continuity of the project. Nuclear science, which required collaboration and long-term planning, advanced slowly in an environment where institutional stability was limited and priorities frequently changed. In 1943, the stagnation of the program was evident. The German physicists had correctly identified the theoretical requirements to build a critical reactor and understood the principles of uranium enrichment. But the lack of materials, the vulnerability of heavy water production, the absence of industrial infrastructure, and institutional competition prevented substantial progress. The experiments were becoming smaller and smaller, while the expectations of success were diminishing. The Haigerloch reactor represented the last significant attempt of the German program. It showed advances compared to previous experiments, but it fell far short of reaching the final goal. The necessary physics was established, but the engineering and resources to carry it out were not available. The program continued to exist, but its strategic impact had been reduced to a minimum. This scenario contrasted with the developments that were beginning to take shape in the United States, where administrative and industrial decisions were generating a project of unprecedented dimensions. While Germany faced increasing limitations, the Allies were advancing down a different path that would transform nuclear fission into a military tool before the end of the war. When the German nuclear program was advancing with increasing difficulties, the United States response took on dimensions that were unprecedented in history. In June of 1942, the Uranium Advisory Committee created by Franklin Roosevelt ceased to exist and was replaced by a completely new structure, the Manhattan Engineer District. The name, which concealed its true function under an administrative reference, marked the beginning of a military project with national scope. Its objective was clear: to turn nuclear fission into an operational weapon before the war ended. The command of the new program fell to Leslie Groves, who was appointed Brigadier General shortly before taking over leadership. He came from the Army Corps of Engineers, where he had overseen the construction of the Pentagon under strict deadlines and with precise resource control. His experience demonstrated that he could manage enormous projects under demanding conditions. Although he lacked training in nuclear physics, Groves possessed the administrative tools to coordinate scientists, engineers, contractors, and supply chains in all corners of the country. His task was not to solve equations, but to create a structure capable of transforming theory into practical results without delay. Groves needed a scientific director capable of integrating multiple lines of work and turning them into a coherent effort. The choice fell on J. Robert Oppenheimer, theoretical physicist from the University of California at Berkeley. Although his career included more intellectual contributions than formal leadership, he had deep knowledge of the physics involved in fission, understood the diversity of problems involved in designing a nuclear weapon, and had the ability to dialogue with specialists from different areas. The combination of Groves and Oppenheimer provided a balance between military organization and technical understanding that would be decisive. The first structural decision was to concentrate the scattered research into university centers within dedicated facilities operating under strict secrecy. The production of fissile materials would not be delegated to preliminary experiments. It would start on an industrial scale from the very beginning, even though the methods were not yet fully refined. Multiple simultaneous approaches would be adopted in enrichment and plutonium production, with the intention that, if one failed, another would continue the progress. This redundant model implied high costs, but eliminated single points of failure. The United States needed to obtain materials suitable for producing a rapid chain reaction. There were two main options: enriching natural uranium to increase the proportion of uranium-235, or producing plutonium by irradiating uranium-238 in reactors. Plutonium did not exist in nature, but calculations indicated it was highly fissionable, justifying investment in both avenues. Thus, while uranium enrichment plants were being designed, reactors were being prepared to generate plutonium. The enrichment of uranium would be addressed through three techniques. Gaseous diffusion consisted of forcing uranium hexafluoride gas through porous membranes, taking advantage of minimal differences in molecular speed. Electromagnetic separation used devices similar to expanded mass spectrometers to deflect isotopes in magnetic fields. Thermal diffusion used temperature gradients to cause partial separation. Groves ordered the construction of facilities for all three methods at the same time, even without knowing which would perform better. For this purpose, a remote area in Tennessee was chosen where a new industrial complex would be built, Oak Ridge. In 1942, there was no city there. Within a matter of months, roads, housing for tens of thousands of workers, and the first structures of what would become one of the largest industrial centers in the country were installed. The K-25 plant, dedicated to gaseous diffusion, reached unprecedented dimensions, a U-shaped building almost 1 kilometer long. A continuous system of thousands of diffusion stages operating in cascade was installed there, each slightly increasing the concentration of uranium-235. The main technological challenge was the manufacture of membranes resistant to uranium hexafluoride. Metallurgy teams developed nickel sintering techniques to achieve uniform and resistant pores. The production scale required coordinating entire supply chains dedicated exclusively to this purpose. Electromagnetic separation was implemented in another plant at the same complex, called Y12. To build the Calutron's magnets, copper was needed in quantities that the war effort could not provide. Groves arranged the temporary use of silver from the United States Treasury. Tons of metal were transformed into coils, used during the war and returned afterward. Although the Calutrons were inefficient, they produced highly enriched uranium in quantities sufficient for a prototype weapon if operated continuously. As Oak Ridge expanded, another critical component of the program was developing in Chicago. There, Enrico Fermi built the first experimental nuclear reactor in December of 1942, known as Chicago Pile 1. The design consisted of a pile of ultra-pure graphite blocks with natural uranium embedded in channels. The graphite acted as a moderator, slowing down the neutrons without absorbing them excessively. Cadmium rods regulated the reaction through controlled absorption. When the rods were gradually removed, the multiplication of neutrons reached the critical value. The chain reaction became self-sustaining. It was the experimental demonstration that a functional reactor could be built with available materials and could operate stably under supervision. Once this phase was overcome, attention shifted to the next step, building large-scale production reactors capable of generating kilograms of plutonium. The chosen location for these reactors was Hanford, in the state of Washington. The decision was based on the availability of water from the Columbia River, necessary to cool high-power reactors. In an arid land far from urban centers, a complex emerged composed of reactors, chemical processing plants, and residential areas for the workers. The technical complexity was enormous. The reactors experienced problems such as uranium deformation and graphite expansion at high temperatures. Progressive solutions were implemented through successive tests and rapid design modifications. The plutonium produced by the reactors had to be chemically separated from the irradiated uranium, a process carried out in plants called canyons, large shielded buildings where highly radioactive substances were handled using remote controls. In these plants, the irradiated uranium was chemically dissolved and went through precipitation stages that isolated the plutonium. The intensity of the radiation forced the implementation of complex shielding, remote handling, and controlled ventilation systems. The entire process was developed in environments where no worker had direct contact with the material. While Oak Ridge and Hanford were producing fissionable materials, Oppenheimer organized the Central Weapons Design Laboratory in Los Alamos and New Mexico. From the middle of 1943, scientists and technicians began arriving at the facility, located on a plateau far from urban centers and accessible only by guarded roads. There, theoretical and experimental contributions from multiple disciplines were collected. The concentration of experts in one place allowed for the acceleration of critical decisions. The design of the bombs posed problems that required simultaneous calculations of theoretical physics, metallurgy, explosives engineering, and fluid mechanics. For uranium-235, the gun-type design consisted of firing one subcritical mass against another using a cylindrical tube. When both came together, they formed a supercritical mass, and the chain reaction developed explosively. This design required large quantities of highly enriched uranium, but its operation was considered reliable. For plutonium, a different challenge arose. The plutonium produced in reactors contained plutonium-240, an isotope that fissioned spontaneously at a rate sufficient to cause a premature detonation in a gun-type design. The solution was implosion. Compress a sphere of plutonium using explosives arranged in the form of lenses. These directed the shock wave towards the center uniformly, increasing the density of the material and reducing the critical mass. The technique required extreme precision. The detonations had to be initiated simultaneously with microsecond tolerances. Small irregularities in the compression would invalidate the experiment. The development of the implosion involved multiple groups. Seth Neddermeyer proposed the initial concept. George Kistiakowsky refined the explosives through lens designs with different detonation velocities. John von Neumann contributed calculations to model the compression. The teams conducted hundreds of explosive tests in isolated areas of New Mexico. High-speed cameras recorded each detonation to evaluate symmetry and power. In early 1945, the two designs were advancing toward their final phase. The uranium bomb, called Little Boy, was considered ready without prior testing, given that the available material was scarce and the underlying physical principles were trusted. The plutonium design, named Fat Man, required a complete test due to its greater complexity. For this, a remote location known as Jornada del Muerto near Alamogordo, New Mexico, was chosen. The test device, called Gadget, was placed atop a metal tower. On the 16th of July 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, the device detonated. The energy released was equivalent to about 22,000 tons of TNT. The test, called Trinity, confirmed that the implosion worked and that the plutonium produced in Hanford could be used in an effective weapon. With this demonstration, the United States possessed an operational nuclear weapon before the global conflict ended. The Manhattan Project had gone from theoretical concepts to functional systems through a combination of resources, centralized coordination, and strategic decisions made quickly. The magnitude of the effort stood out for its scale. More than 130,000 people worked on one or another component of the project. The industrial facilities built for the production of fissionable materials occupied areas comparable to those of entire cities. The total cost exceeded $2 billion of the time, financed through federal allocations approved in secret. The difference with the German effort was evident. While Germany operated with limited resources, dispersed facilities, and fluctuating priorities, the United States had centralized authority, allocated extraordinary resources, and mobilized an unprecedented industrial infrastructure. The advancements in Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos represented the convergence of political decisions, industrial capabilities, and scientific organization. The Trinity test made it clear that nuclear fission had shifted from being a laboratory phenomenon to a real component of the United States military arsenal. The use of the developed weapons would depend on decisions involving strategic, military, and diplomatic factors. What followed was no longer a technical challenge, but the evaluation of how to employ a new power system in a war environment that was approaching its final phase. When the Trinity test confirmed that the United States possessed a functional nuclear weapon, the leadership of the Manhattan Project needed to answer a still unresolved question. How close had Germany come to achieving the same? The available reports were fragmentary. Some suggested progress, others indicated setbacks. Without direct access to the German laboratories, the analysis remained incomplete. The only way to gain certainty was to get ahead of the Allied advance, identify relevant scientific facilities, and secure documents, materials, and personnel before they disappeared or were captured by other powers. To accomplish this goal, the ILSOS mission was created. Formed in December of 1943, ALSOS combined military and scientific functions. Its military leadership was under the charge of Lieutenant Colonel Boris Pasch, an officer with experience in counterintelligence who had supervised security aspects of the Manhattan Project. The scientific chief was Samuel Gaudsmit, a physicist who personally knew a good part of the German scientific community before the war. Both understood that each day lost implied a greater risk of sensitive facilities being destroyed or evacuated. They also knew that the Soviet Union was advancing from the east and that any information captured by them would be out of American reach. The first phase operated in Italy at the beginning of 1944. Accompanying the Allied advance, Pasch and his team inspected laboratories and universities. They found little. The Italian projects had been limited and showed no signs of a systematic nuclear program. The conclusion was that any significant activity must be in territory directly controlled by Germany. The focus then shifted towards France, Belgium, and, finally, the Reich itself. With the Normandy landing in June of 1944, Alsos accompanied the Allied forces to Paris. The city was home to Frédéric Joliot-Curie, a significant figure in nuclear research before the war. When Paris was liberated in August, Pasch's team arrived at the Collège de France. Joliot-Curie provided detailed information about German confiscations of equipment, especially heavy water, and explained that the occupiers were mainly interested in controlled uranium reactions rather than weapons. He also mentioned names of German physicists involved and potential laboratory locations. His testimony helped to direct the efforts, but it did not solve the main question, the actual degree of progress of the German program. In September, Alsos advanced towards Belgium. In Antwerp, they visited the headquarters of Union Minière, responsible for the uranium mines of the Belgian Congo. Although many files had been removed by the Germans, remaining documents indicated that large amounts of refined uranium had been sent to Germany. That confirmed the availability of raw material, but did not provide evidence about its final use. By that time, the Allied advance was slowing down in the face of German resistance, and Alsos had to wait for the offensive to resume in order to penetrate regions where the main research centers were located. In November of 1944, the capture of Strasbourg provided the first significant breakthrough. In offices at the university, documents belonging to Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker were found. The reports included theoretical calculations on critical mass, conceptual reactor designs, and correspondence between German physicists. Gaudsmit examined the materials and noted errors in fundamental estimates. The documentation showed a program that had progressed in conceptual understanding, but was operating far from a usable bomb. Although this discovery was encouraging, the documents were not enough. It was necessary to physically verify the scientific facilities to confirm whether there were undocumented projects or advanced work elsewhere. The German offensive in the Ardennes delayed the Allied advance. Only from March of 1945, with the Americans crossing the Rhine, Alsos could continue. The documentary analysis indicated that the core of the German nuclear work was located in the south, in Hechingen, Haigerloch, and Tailfingen. According to preliminary agreements among the Allies, that region would fall under French control. If France arrived first, it would capture the laboratories and possibly also the scientists. For Groves and Pasch, that was unacceptable. The priority was to prevent another power from obtaining sensitive information before the United States completed its own evaluation. On April 22, 1945, Pasch decided to advance quickly towards Hechingen with a reduced detachment. On the way, they faced scattered resistance, although no organized German unit managed to stop them. In Hechingen, they found offices, small laboratories, and documents detailing recent calculations. However, the experimental reactor was not there. Additional reports pointed to a conditioned cave in Haigerloch, a few kilometers away. Alsos arrived in Haigerloch on the 23rd of April. The reactor was installed in a cavern dug out under a church. Inside, they found a metal tank with an internal structure of metallic uranium cubes suspended in a geometric matrix submerged in heavy water. The surrounding reflector was made of graphite. Measurement equipment remained in place. Everything indicated that the installation had not been sabotaged or dismantled before the Allied arrival. Goldsmith made immediate calculations based on the mass and distribution of the uranium and the amount of heavy water present. His conclusion was that the reactor was not close to criticality. It was the most advanced experiment of the German program, but it had not managed to initiate a self-sustaining reaction. Pasch ordered the immediate dismantling. The uranium cubes were removed and sent to the United States. The heavy water was extracted and transported out of Germany. With the removal of the Haigerloch reactor, the last German effort to achieve an operational nuclear system disappeared. However, the mission was not over. It was necessary to locate the key scientists of the program, to interrogate them, and directly assess their level of knowledge and technical capabilities. Initial interrogations indicated that Werner Heisenberg had fled south with his family. Alsos organized a search operation. In May, the team moved into Bavaria, where scattered SS units were still operating. On the 3rd of May, in the village of Urfeld, by Lake Walchen, they found the residence where Heisenberg was taking refuge. According to Pasch's reports, he offered no resistance. He was arrested and taken into custody. With his capture, Alsos secured the leading theoretical figure of the German nuclear program. In the following days, the mission located other prominent physicists. Otto Hahn was found in Tailfingen. Max von Laue was detained in a nearby town. Walter Gerlach, who had overseen the organization of the project in its final phase, was captured in Munich. Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Kurt Diebner, and other relevant members were also detained. The presence of all of them in Allied hands allowed for the reconstruction of the internal functioning of the program much more completely than through documents. The next issue was how to interrogate them and assess the truthfulness of their statements. To this end, it was decided to transfer the 10 captured scientists to England, where they would be isolated from the outside and under discreet surveillance. The chosen destination was Farm Hall, a mansion equipped with hidden recording systems that would allow their conversations to be monitored without constant interrogations. The scientists were unaware that they were being listened to, which made it easier to obtain more accurate information about their opinions and their actual knowledge. Farm Hall became an essential source of information. For 6 months, every conversation was recorded. What emerged from those recordings was not a linear account, but a collection of technical observations and discussions that revealed the degree of understanding reached by the German program. They confirmed that the critical mass calculations had been inconsistent, that there were no enrichment facilities, and that the material resources had been insufficient for any industrial-scale effort. The key moment occurred on August 6, 1945, when scientists were informed of the bomb being dropped on Hiroshima. The news generated lengthy discussions about the amount of material necessary, the technical possibility of manufacturing a device, and the differences between the American and the German approach. What became evident in those conversations was that the German program had never progressed beyond an incomplete experimental reactor and some preliminary calculations on theoretical weapons. It had neither designed a functional device nor initiated the production of weapon-suitable materials. The Farm Hall transcripts, later analyzed by United States and British authorities, showed that the gap between the German and American efforts was wide in every aspect: theory, experimentation, industrial production, and political support. The findings of Alsos and the Farm Hall recordings provided a complete picture. The German nuclear program had existed, but it had never posed an immediate threat. Its development had been limited by material shortages, misguided technical decisions, and a lack of administrative coordination. With this information, those responsible for the Manhattan Project were able to definitively conclude that Germany had not advanced toward an operational nuclear weapon. That certainty retrospectively clarified a fear that had driven critical decisions throughout the entire war. But at the same time, it raised another question: how would the international balance change now that a single power possessed a tested nuclear weapon ready to be used? That question would become the starting point for the final stage of the global conflict. The results of the American effort first manifested in the New Mexico desert. The Trinity test, conducted on the 16th of July, 1945, confirmed that the implosion design worked as planned. The device, installed on a steel tower, used conventional explosives distributed in carefully calibrated lenses to compress plutonium to high densities. That compression drove the material above its critical mass in microseconds. The energy release equaled more than 20,000 tons of TNT. Measurements recorded after the detonation showed that approximately 1 kilogram of plutonium had completely fissioned. The detonation produced a shock wave, an ascending dust column, and a high-temperature region that experimentally verified the models developed at Los Alamos. The team that observed the test, located in bunkers miles away, confirmed that the instruments recorded the expected yield. Among those present was J. Robert Oppenheimer, who verbally referenced an ancient text upon observing the initial flash. That was not part of the technical analysis, but it was recorded in later reports. For the military leadership, the conclusion was operational. The bomb was ready for immediate use. General Leslie Groves communicated the result to Washington following the established protocols. At that moment, 2 weapons were available, or nearly so. Little Boy, a gun-type device using highly enriched uranium, was already assembled. Fat Man, based on the implosion design tested at Trinity, was being prepared. The transition from the scientific realm to the political was complete. It was now up to the President to decide how to use the weapon in the context of the war in the Pacific. Harry Truman, in office since April after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, was at the Potsdam Conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. There, the reorganization of Europe after the German defeat was being discussed. The German army had surrendered months earlier. Berlin was occupied. The structures of the Reich had collapsed. However, Japan continued to fight despite the loss of key territories and the incendiary bombings that had destroyed entire cities. The estimates of the United States command for a land invasion of the main islands varied, but all agreed that the casualties would be extremely high. On the 24th of July, Truman received the full report on Trinity. The Interim Committee, an advisory group created to study issues related to the weapon's use, had been discussing possible options for weeks. Their conclusions were based on strictly strategic criteria. They indicated that the bomb should be used as soon as possible on a target that clearly demonstrated its destructive capability. The recommendation included not warning Japan beforehand, on the grounds that an on-site demonstration would be more convincing than a detonation in an uninhabited area. The President accepted the recommendation and authorized the use of the weapon. The decisions were made in a context where strategic bombings had already produced massive destruction, both in Europe and in Asia, through fires caused by thousands of tons of conventional explosives. The atomic bomb introduced a qualitative leap in the way of generating that destruction, but it responded to an already established military logic. At the conference, Truman mentioned to Stalin that the United States possessed a new weapon with significant power. The phrase was recorded as a brief comment. Stalin did not visibly react. Later documents showed that he was already informed about the development of the bomb through espionage activities, but that knowledge was not expressed in the meeting. The immediate consequence was to accelerate the geopolitical relevance of nuclear weaponry in international negotiations. On the 26th of July, the Potsdam Declaration was issued, an ultimatum directed at Japan to accept unconditional surrender. The declaration did not specifically reference the nuclear weapon, though it hinted at an unprecedented destructive capability. The Japanese government rejected the ultimatum. With that refusal, the preparations to use the bomb continued unchanged. The first mission was assigned to the 509th Composite Group, unit trained for special operations, with modified B-29s. Little Boy was transferred to the island of Tinian in the Pacific. Colonel Paul Tibbets was designated as the main pilot. The bomber Enola Gay, equipped with structural modifications to accommodate the bomb, took off in the early morning of the 6th of August of 1945. The designated target was Hiroshima, a city with military and administrative relevance that had avoided major previous bombings. At 8:15 in the morning, the bomber released the bomb from an altitude of over 9,000 meters. Little Boy descended for tens of seconds before detonating at approximately 600 meters above the city. The explosion generated a sphere of extreme heat, followed by a blast wave that destroyed structures for several kilometers around. The thermal radiation caused immediate fires. The initial estimate of casualties was tens of thousands in the first moments. The medical infrastructure was rendered unusable, which hindered any organized response. The dispersion of radioactive particles generated additional effects in the hours and days afterwards. As Japan assessed the magnitude of the attack, the United States publicly confirmed that it had used an atomic bomb. Truman declared that if Japan did not accept the terms of surrender, further actions would follow. Although the United States had only a second bomb ready, this information was not known to Japan. The Japanese government began internal deliberations. Communications from Hiroshima were limited, but aerial reports and fragmented testimonies made it clear that a single bomb had destroyed the city. Various responses were considered, but no immediate consensus was reached. The situation changed when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on the 8th of August and began operations in Manchuria according to previous agreements made in Yalta. On August 9th, a second bomb was prepared for use. Fat Man was loaded onto the B-29 boxcar under the command of Major Charles Sweeney. The primary target was Kokura, but atmospheric conditions prevented the required visual identification. After several failed attempts and with fuel limiting the operation, the plane headed to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The mountainous topography of the region partially confined the shockwave, but the detonation at 500 meters height produced an extensive level of destruction. The initial victims were estimated in the tens of thousands. The combined impact of the two attacks and the Soviet offensive led the Japanese government to reconsider its position. Emperor Hirohito intervened to support the acceptance of the surrender under the conditions established in Potsdam. The public announcement was issued on August 15th. The formal signing of the surrender occurred on September 2nd in Tokyo Bay aboard the battleship USS Missouri. With the end of the war, the assessment of the German nuclear program could be completed. Alsos had determined that Germany had neither constructed an operational reactor nor produced fissionable material in substantial quantities. The farm hall recordings showed that the German scientists understood certain theoretical aspects, but lacked the industrial means and administrative coordination to advance beyond the laboratory. In contrast, the United States had managed to coordinate research, engineering, and production on a national scale. The strategic decisions made between 1942 and 1945 allowed nuclear fission to be turned into a usable weapon in less than 3 years. The differences between both programs reflected structural conditions. Germany scattered resources among rival projects and never granted absolute priority to nuclear development. The loss of specialized personnel further reduced its capacity. The United States, on the contrary, integrated multiple lines of work under a unified command, built large-scale industrial facilities, and allocated unlimited resources to the objective. The American success raised questions that transcended the Second World War. With the proven existence of nuclear weapons, the relationship between powers underwent a profound transformation. The American monopoly was temporary. The Soviet Union would start its own program shortly after, following information obtained through espionage and its own developments. Other countries would advance in the same direction. The nuclear race, started in the 1930s as scientific research, transformed after 1945 into a central component of international politics. The question that had motivated the initial urgency of the Manhattan Project, whether Germany would obtain the bomb first, gave way to a broader and more enduring issue: what a world would be like in which several powers had weapons capable of causing destruction on an unprecedented scale.